Hello, everyone. My name is Albert Świdziński. Thank you for tuning in to another Strategy and Future podcast. With me today is General Robert Spalding, a former U.S. Air Force general and a former B-2 driver, B-2 bomber driver, which is a great detail to me. General, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Thank you. The reason, the key reason really why we're having this conversation today is to discuss your book that was published in late 2021, I believe, entitled "War Without Rules: China's Playbook for Global Domination," which has now been translated into Polish. And it's I'm not very good at plugs, so forgive me, but this is the book. This is the cover of the book. It's a beautiful book. I've read it both in its original English and in Polish, and basically would like to discuss the book today. General, the book is I think the reason for the book is to try to make it more accessible, to make a book written by two Chinese colonels back in the day when they wrote the book more accessible to international audiences. The original book was entitled Unrestricted Warfare, I believe, and it was written in 1999, and or it was translated into English in 1999. You've read it in 1999, but you've published this book, your book, nearly quarter of century later. Why did you decide to focus so much on this book quarter of a century after it was first translated into English?
Well, when the book was originally translated into English, I read it. Of course, it had been translated by the CIA's Open Source Center. CIA Open Source Center basically translate publicly available documents in foreign languages for people like me, who was a captain in the Air Force, to read and understand. And for the most part, I discounted the book. And the reason I discounted the book is because these two PLA Air Force lieutenant colonels were so far ahead of their time in terms of anticipating the opportunities to China available through globalization and the internet that, I could scarcely understand it as a B-2 pilot at Whiteman Air Force Base back then. Now, when I reread it as a senior colonel at the Pentagon, advising the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, I had a new appreciation for the document and really studied it to understand better what they were saying. And once you get the concepts that they are talking about, it really opens your eyes to the possibilities of warfare in the 21st century, where weapons no longer become the primary means for getting your geopolitical interests answered.
Sorry. So if I could ask, what is the main premise of the book, both of the original and your book, in relation to Chinese strategy vis-a-vis the United States?
Particularly China scholars have talked about it as kind of a strategy document. And especially the pundits, they've said, this is not really a strategy adopted by the Chinese, and they've discounted the book. But when you study the book and you understand what they were doing from the perspective of a military officer, of the strategist, then you begin to see it wasn't a book about strategy. It was a book about doctrine. And we use doctrine in the military to apply principles that allow you to plan, wars and campaigns to be successful. You adopt these principles that are based on lessons learned in prior wars. So, what did other militaries do when they were fighting, and what was successful, what was not successful? These are distilled into principles that become doctrine. So they were basically taking principles that they had seen play out in the financial markets, in the trade arena, in economics, in media, and especially with the beginning rise of the internet, they were attempting to take lessons that the Chinese Communist Party had learned and distill those into principles to create a doctrine for success against the West. And you know, when you look at it in that light, most people, if you're not in the military, if you haven't studied military history or studied how wars are planned or fought, you wouldn't recognize this as a doctrine document. And even I, in the beginning, didn't understand, so much what I was reading. And so I think understanding it first as a set of principles that you could use to be successful against the West, because what they were trying to say was, of course, it came 10 years after, almost 10 years after the Gulf War. They had seen the tremendous military might of the U.S. military, and they said, this is not an area that we should choose. China should choose to compete directly with the United States. They're too far ahead of us. But if you look at the internet and globalization, and you look at the ability to use media and trade and economics and finance and politics and geopolitics to begin to move the world to be more friendly to our authoritarian system and to slowly undermine the liberal rule-based order, then we have it's going to take a long time, but we have a road to success by following these principles. And the other thing they did is they studied the collapse of the Soviet Union. So why did the Soviet Union collapse? They weren't defeated militarily. Their economy was destroyed, and their economy was destroyed because they were cut off from the free world's technology, talent, and capital. So the other thing that had happened, and all of these elements play into this book. The other thing that had happened is Tiananmen Square. So when you take the Gulf War and the enormous military might of the United States, you say, okay, we're not going to go there. If you look at Tiananmen Square and say, okay, the internet and globalization are good, except these ideas come into our population, these ideas of freedom and self-determination, and we have to create a filter so that only the technology, talent, and capital that we do need to grow our society and not end up like the Soviet Union. These are the principles that you should embrace. And the principles really are, we need to let the technology, talent, and capital in, but ensure that we have strict control over the narrative and over the political process and over what the people understand in terms of ideology. And so, we need to separate the things that are coming from the West into ideology bucket and kind of economic bucket. And we will grow our economic prosperity, but we will not allow the ideology to penetrate our society. These are the elements, then, the principles that they use to create things like the Great Firewall. It is what caused them to create a financial system with a non-convertible currency. You think about it today, there's not a single country on the planet that has a non-convertible currency except for China, and yet China is part of the World Bank, the IMF. Again, we need to be part of these international institutions, but we should not follow their rules because their rules favor the liberal democratic order. We want rules that favor our order. So we're going to join these things like the World Trade Organization, like the World Health Organization, like the UN Human Rights Council, and then slowly we're going to make these organizations promote our interests, our policies that promote the survival of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, this, is what the United States and its allies did after World War II and through the Cold War. And so after the end of the Cold War, you saw this tremendous opening up of the former Soviet states to be democracies. And China realized that, hey, if we're going to be dominant, if we're going to survive as a party, we have to get our arms around controlling ideology of the Chinese people. And globalization and the internet is a path to bring those ideologies in. So we have to join to get that benefit, but we must not let the ideology in. And that's how, it kind of drove them to do these decisions, these policies, create their, digital infrastructure in such a way that allowed them to be successful.
Right. Because again, just a couple dates. 1999 is where the book was published. In 2001, uh, the Chinese People's Republic joins PRC, People's Republic of China, excuse me, joins the WTO. And I know this is a statement, a thesis that could come off as insensitive to many Americans, but many claim that the most important thing that happened in 2001 was, in fact, the Chinese joining the WTO, becoming a full member of the organization. And this was, of course, the same year that 9/11 happened and sent the US on a 20-year long path of really chasing its own tail, right? And trying to establish democracies in the Middle East. But what was the point? At which point? Because you mentioned a couple of at least a lot of grievances with the Chinese. The most recent one was COVID-19 and the way the Chinese managed the situation. At which point did you realize that China is not about to become a law-abiding member of the international community and rather is looking to, in one way or another, challenge the U.S. and the position the U.S. has?
So, I went to Defense Language Institute to learn to study Chinese in 2001. So I actually got there in May prior to 9/11. And so when all of my colleagues went to fight the war in the Middle East, I went to China. Now, you know, China was in an incredible place then. I arrived with my family in Shanghai in 2002, and we lived in Pudong, which is the east side of the Huangpu River, which is all the area that the Chinese Communist Party had developed. Puxi, the west side of the river, is where all of the former territories of the various Western countries was on, for instance, the Bund. So you had a lot of old architecture on the west side and brand new architecture on the east side. But China was exploding, growing like crazy. All my neighbors were building factories in the Shanghai Special Economic Zone. Every Fortune 500 company was in China to try to capture that market share and take advantage of low-cost labor. And when I left in 2004, I was amazed. The Chinese people were friendly. The country was open. It was very inviting. And I told my wife, hey, I want to come back after I retire from the military and do business in Shanghai. And of course, I had to go back and give my service to the U.S. Air Force, but I always intended to go back. But as I rose in rank to colonel, the Air Force decided, hey, we want to send you back to be the defense attaché, the senior defense official in Beijing. And so I had a series of assignments, first at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York City, where I'd met a lot of business and political leaders, particularly, surrounding the UN General Assembly, when a lot of senior political leaders from around the world come to the Council on Foreign Relations and talk about the issues facing their country. I went from there to advise the chairman of the Joint Chiefs at the Pentagon on China. And it was at during this time, it was the fall of 2014, when I received a briefing from a colleague from the business community. This briefing had been developed by one of the top 5 audit agencies in the country, and it was describing attack after attack, economic attack on American companies by the Chinese. And when I opened this up in my cubicle in the Pentagon and looked at the presentation, I recognized the same elements of, the principles of war that we had used, particularly during the Kosovo War. So during the Kosovo War, which was about a 60-day air campaign, I participated in that as a B-2 pilot. And what you find from that conflict is, once we started to take away the assets of the elites in Serbia supporting Milosevic, it was very soon that the war was over. So what we are seeing is a systematic destruction of the assets of the elites in the United States by the Chinese Communist Party using means not bombs but ones and zeros and dollars and cents. So the elements of globalization and the internet that allow you to have allow financial transactions to move across borders, that allow the Chinese to be deeply embedded in our corporate sector and our financial sector. And when I saw that, it really struck me as I think the first time that I recognized that I didn't understand the way the world worked, and so that forced me to go and reread Unrestricted Warfare, reread or read the Chinese Communist Party Constitution, and compare that with the People's Republic of China Constitution. Most people don't realize that China has two constitutions. So what country has that? And of course, we know that the sovereign is the Chinese Communist Party. So and then I started to read the writings of Xi Jinping, read things like Tiananmen Papers. And as you start to study, and we really did study with a team of China experts at the Pentagon, from 2014 to 2016, when you study the Chinese Communist Party, you begin to recognize that the things that you see around you are not what they appear to be. It's almost like the movie The Matrix, when Neo gets shot and he comes back to life and he can see all the connections. As we started to read these documents and then understand China's role in the corporate sector, in our universities, in the financial sector, in our political process, we began to see the connections that allowed them to manipulate our society in much the same way that we had used B-2s with 2,000-pound bombs to manipulate the leadership of Serbia's society. So it was that point that I really start to really understand that I needed to be more focused on the economic, the financial, the technological, the political, the media, the academic side of our society, and understand both the vulnerabilities, but then how China was applying these principles to exploit those vulnerabilities in order for me to understand my role in, my taking oath, which is I have to support and defend the Constitution of the United States as a military officer. And what the conclusion I came to was that I could no longer, do that as a military officer, because the Chinese Communist Party had decided that that was a way that you would lose if you went up against the United States. So better to take these other paths, undermine the society from within, destroy the social cohesion of the society, and eventually its productivity and economic opportunity. And these would be the things that would be catalysts to change the overall underlying nature of our republic. And so that is when 2014, in the fall of 2014, is when I really had an awakening and I had a change of perspective. Before that, I thought China was a great partner. I wanted to do business in China, when I retired from the Air Force. But I was, so mistaken.
I understand, but when I read the excerpts from the original book, when the Chinese colonels described the war in Iraq, the first Gulf War, and how successful the US was, they also focused. I mean, there was the element of admiration for the military prowess, but they also had a perhaps somewhat cynical view of how the US create a coalition, and how the war also served a broader political objective, as in a breaking point where the US, sort of is able to muster up a coalition, provide legitimacy to its actions. But you're right that in the West, people consider war, following the legacy of 30 Years' War and the Treaty of Westphalia, as a distinct phenomenon, right? And China doesn't, right? This is what the war is a continuation of policy by other means, but other tools of state power are equally important, right? Political, social. But again, how is this? And I think the Chinese had a feeling that, or they were claiming that the US does the same thing, and this was the argument, right? Do you agree with her? Because again, if you look at how the US managed to remain on top, of course, there was a very important element of co-optation, right? The liberalism that became widely adopted for good reasons, but nevertheless, it was an element of co-optation. So how is what the Chinese are positing different from what the US does, as a, not in terms of moral, but in terms of tool set, so to speak.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the success of the U.S. Model, particularly as it pertains to coalition building, really has to do with an enabling of economic opportunity, and I think that's the one thing that the Chinese recognize, and that's inherent in the Belt and Road Initiative. But if you think about it, what happened, and this was, by the way, this was Osama bin Laden's goal. We departed from that model. So when you say, and when they say the United States was successful, what we're talking about here is the Cold War. But it wasn't so much that we were successful at undermining the Soviet Union. Instead, it was successful in creating a safe space for democracy to thrive by cutting off access of the Soviet Union to technology, talent, and capital, and the ability to do active measures in free societies. So democracies are not good at fighting the Chinese Communist Party way of war. We're just not. It is very easy to get us fighting against each other when you have an entity like the Chinese Communist Party that has full access to our society. So successful in this type of competition is by having isolation between the two sides. When you have economic and technological isolation, then free societies, societies made up of rule of law systems, where the companies and the people generally abide by laws, and they're allowed to trade together freely. They're allowed to mingle together, to exchange ideas through academia, to work together, geopolitically, to solve problems that extend beyond any one country's interests. Then they're able to be very successful and establish economic opportunity and freedom for its citizens. Now, when you take that system and you look at it from the side of the Soviet Union, because it's such a repressive system, they're not able to be as successful, and that's why the Soviet Union collapsed. So what the Chinese Communist Party realized was they needed to maintain control of the society, but still capture that success of the West. And the only way they could do it is being embedded in the West. And so when you think about it, yes, they were saying, "Hey, the United States has made the international order in its image," but it wasn't an exclusive image. It was meant to be inclusive in that other democracies could benefit from it by joining it. That's the whole point. If we can show you a way to unleash the productivity of your citizens and allow them to reach their true potential, then your citizens are going to say, well, that's what the system that we want. And of course, this was very successful during the Cold War. But what we've done since is really bring China, which is the biggest violator of the rules of the rules-based order. Now we've basically poisoned the well. And so the Chinese Communist Party are able to protect themselves because they don't look at the world in the same way that the liberal democratic order does. Rules don't matter to them. And so since rules don't matter, they can do whatever they want. And generally, our own companies, for example, have to play by the rules or we punish them. So in this way, that we have vulnerabilities in our system, we cannot fight in the same way that these two, with the doctrine that these two Communist Party PLA Air Force lieutenant colonels write, because they're writing for a communist system. If we were to embrace those principles, we would, in fact, ourselves become communist. And so what we have to do is take a step back and recognize that they have a strategy designed to defeat us using our own vulnerabilities and our own cooperation to do so. And the only way that we can protect ourselves is to separate ourselves as free societies, as rule-based systems, cooperate for the benefit of citizens. One thing that you'll notice, whether it's Europe or the United States or any other democracy in the world, since the Chinese became part of the liberal democratic order, productivity and economic opportunity for citizens has declined. It's declined in Europe, it's declined in America, it's declined in Asia for everybody but the Chinese. So everybody, and then what happens is leaders and citizens begin to look at their model and say, oh, if we want to be successful, if we want to have economic opportunity, then we should embrace the Chinese model. And that's what they want. They want, the rest of societies to begin to embrace this model. So in a sense, it is similar to things like the United States did, the Marshall Plan, rebuilding, Japan and Korea and Taiwan. Yes, very similar, but they are fully embedded. The way we were able to do it is only by isolating, the Soviet Union. If we had let the Soviet Union in like we let the Chinese, the whole world would be authoritarian now.
But as you point out, those are two very different animals, right? The Soviet Union and China. And if you look at how the industrial base in the US was hollowed out, and the Rust Belt and everything like this, at the end of the day, sure, it was actually, that's a question, whether it was more Chinese malevolence or the short-sightedness and greed of the US companies that that at the end of the day outsource their production. And I mean, this is on the one hand, just that short-sightedness and greed. On the other, access to cheap products from China, for as the European politicians point out, was a significant downward input on inflation. Like, it kept it low. So there were objective benefits. It wasn't just naivete, so to speak, but there were objective benefits. And so which one was it more, and whether those positive inputs can be discounted now when dealing with China?
No, I think you're absolutely correct. I mean, they identified the key vulnerability of the U.S. system and of the system of rule-based democracies around the world, and that is the tendency for capitalist economies. Now, I think what we recognized during the first Cold War is that we had to restrain the animal spirits, if you will, of the corporate sector, or else they would have done business with the Soviets. They would have given them all of our technology, because that's what businesses do. Of course, the business is not responsible for the security and the preservation of the society, the social and cultural and political underpinnings of that society. They're only responsible to their shareholders to provide profit. And so it is incumbent on the government to be the moderating factor for business. Now, there's what happens and this is really the other vulnerability in democracies, is that because greed is such a powerful motivator, then the corporate sector and the financial sector can use the promise of greed to move the political system in their favor. And in moving the political system in their favor, what they're doing is they're actually working as a proxy for the Chinese Communist Party, because the Chinese Communist Party wants to be embedded with the corporate sector and the financial sector. So anytime, especially in the United States, but I would imagine any other democracy around the world, where politicians want to create policies that would protect their citizens from the predations of the Chinese Communist Party, they're dealing with the business community who is getting profits and investment and who are trying to be in the Chinese market, all of which the Chinese Communist Party is using as levers against them. So in doing so, they are moderating the protective features of democracy. So the government is supposed to respond to threats to the society by creating laws that actually protect the society. But in this case, that lawmaking process is influenced by their own corporate and financial sector, who in turn are influenced by the Chinese Communist Party. So greed, and then the ability to use that greed to moderate or slow down any protective features that might be introduced by the leaders of the country is in the Chinese Communist Party playbook, and I think it's very effective. We have seen it to be very effective, and we see it every single day. You know, the fact that the president of the United States, is very concerned about angering Xi Jinping. When we think about it, it should be more concerned about how do I preserve the economic opportunity and the rights and the freedoms of citizens, not what Xi Jinping wants. But we are so concerned about Xi Jinping. Why? Because our own corporate sector and financial sector are saying we need to do business with China, so don't anger them.
Right. Two things spring to mind. I remember the story from '87. I wasn't born back then, but I remember the story about Qualcomm and Toshiba selling their proprietary designs to the Soviets, right? So even back then, when Soviet Union was, about to die, it was still difficult to enforce export controls. And the other one was how recently, back in autumn last year, the US wasn't really willing to share the details of the export controls with the industry because they were afraid of lobbying. But which tells a lot. But what the question I would like to ask: do you think because I think, and again, forgive me if this comes off as arrogant, but I think you, as a military man, at the core, you propose a strategy to defeat China. At the end of the day, I think you suggest a rather strong cutoff, like a divorce, so to speak, of those two economies. But is it the right strategy? Whether should the US be trying to defeat China as you propose, or whether should it try to outcompete it? And again, take a chapter from the China's book and exploit asymmetries rather than do a hard cutoff, which is going to be very difficult.
Well, I mean, I don't subscribe to this idea that you can somehow weave together a relationship with China that allows them no purchase into your political process. I think any financial, economic, trade, academic, political relationship with the Chinese Communist Party, they will exploit to undermine your society. They will exploit to strengthen themselves and to weaken you. So I don't subscribe that you can figure this out. Think about it this way. The other thing is our democracies. The government doesn't have the ability to very precisely control business and say, oh, this technology can go, but that technology can't. Our system doesn't work that way. And it becomes increasingly hard because what happens is business finds ways, like what we've heard. Chips are still going to help the industry that's making nuclear weapons in China. So even though we have export controls, it's the technology is still why? Because we have these other avenues. So by not having a strict cutoff, you give the Chinese the ability to leverage your system in ways that allows them to get what they want. During the Cold War with Qualcomm, we wouldn't even send toys that had microchips to the Soviet Union because we knew that they could take those microchips out and use them for their weapons. So this is when I'm saying that a strict divorce is the only way that we can actually preserve the institutions and the principles and the values of the West. I sincerely believe that. More importantly, think about this: antibiotics or any of the other pharmaceuticals that you find so necessary for modern life to extend the lives of people. All of this stuff comes from China. So what happens when the Chinese Communist Party all of a sudden has a problem with you, like they have with some of the Baltic countries, like they have with Japan, like they have with Korea, and they say, well, we're just going to cut you off. This becomes the problem that you face when you allow the Chinese Communist Party, because quite frankly, they don't care about profit. They care about control of technology and control of markets, because they want to have the ability to not only protect themselves, but also be able to use that in the same way that I use B-2s and 2,000-pound guided bombs. So, it's really about ensuring, and every nation has a responsibility to protect its citizens. In our own Constitution, that's why we created an army and a navy, to protect And that's in many ways why we created the Constitution. The recognition that the colonies alone could not protect each other, and they needed to come together and protect themselves as a group from more powerful countries. But you can't do that in a 21st century context if you don't own any ability to provide the goods that your citizens need to thrive and survive.
So it kind of becomes a zero-sum game at this point in time, right? Like uh,
It very much is a zero-sum game, and the only problem is the Chinese Communist Party recognizes we don't, and as long as we don't, then we'll continue to see no manufacturing in free societies, or no ability to have control over the supply chain for those things that we find critical for the our societies, and therefore we subject our citizens to coercion. And a lot of this coercion, I would imagine that we don't even see. In fact, I would imagine that the Chinese Communist Party's officials have said, look, you don't have the ability to produce this stuff, and it would take you 3 to 5 years to establish that ability. If you push us on this issue, we will cut you off. What's a U.S. politician going to say? Are they going to come and say to the American people, they threatened to cut off our pharmaceuticals. They threatened to cut off antibiotics. They threatened to cut off the precursors for the drugs like insulin that we need. What? No, they're not going to say that. And so there is, and I know there is, a lot of coercion that goes on behind the scenes by the Chinese Communist Party that we're subject to as a people. And it's only because we have allowed them to own the supply chain for the entire world.
So when you look at the China's goals, because this the zero-sum games becomes especially acute when you assume that China is looking to replace the United States as a dominant power in its all capacities, as a rule setter, as a country able to project power across the globe. Do you think this is the goal of the PRC, just to replace the US one to one, and rather does it have a different view of what constitutes ultimate goal, ultimate victory?
Well, the PRC doesn't have a goal. The PRC is not an institution that has any goal whatsoever. The goals come from the sovereign of the country, and that is the Chinese Communist Party, and that's what it says in their constitution. The party is in charge of China, and the party determines the future of China. PRC has no meaning in any context in terms of what does China want? What does the Chinese Communist Party want? Again, they say it right in the constitution. They want to survive, and they see these ideas as written in document number 9. These ideas of democracy and freedom, self-determination, rule of law, free trade. These are all ideas made up by the West to destroy the Chinese Communist Party. Of course, that's preposterous. The founding fathers of America who fled tyranny and wanted to establish a new system that was based on where the government was subservient to the people, not the other way around. There was no idea of the Chinese Communist Party, but there was an idea of what tyranny looked like and how tyranny could take root. And so what these ideas are, particularly the separation of powers in the American Constitution, the ideas are meant to, enable people to thrive and not be subject ever to tyranny. Now, the Chinese Communist Party, all they want to do is survive. These ideas to them are the most dangerous things in the world. Just like if you read the Tiananmen papers, they say, if we let these ideas come into China, the party will be destroyed. We must keep these ideas out. So it's the ideas surrounding the birth of America and the rise of democracies around the world after that are really the main enemies of the Chinese Communist Party. So it's not about the United States. It's about these ideals that the Chinese Communist Party recognizes aim right at the heart of their rule.
But then, as you pointed out, because when it comes to the sources of Chinese Communist Party power, you point out how Shanghai changed, right? And again, is it that they are able to concoct the right kind of propaganda and, have the great firewall and stuff like that? Or whether it is because they did objectively from Deng Xiaoping onwards manage to deliver modernization and, significant improvement in the living standards of the Chinese society. I'm asking this because I understand the premise of trying of considering the Western liberal ideas as the most dangerous threat. But at the same time, tens of millions of Chinese travel across the world every year. Well, not now, but you know what I mean. They used to, but they return,
Right.
and they aren't.
Right.
They don't have a gun to their head. So, is this?
Right.
Are you sure you're applying the pressure at the right place?
Well, let's have a little exercise here. Do you use social media?
Yes, sir. Rarely.
What platforms do you use?
I only use Twitter. I have Facebook, but I don't use it. I'm a
Okay.
bit of a boomer.
Okay. So Twitter and Facebook. So yeah, I don't use Facebook either, but I have it. But I'm mostly on Twitter. Okay. So when you come to the United States or when you travel throughout Europe, when you come to the US, do you get on another platform,
No,
or do
sir.
you just stay on Twitter?
I don't use Weibo.
Okay. Okay. All right. So is Twitter available in China?
No, not without VPN.
No, not to ordinary people. And it's illegal to have a VPN, and of course the party will enforce it in any at the time of their choosing. But so what? So when Clinton said, when China was going to enter the World Trade Organization, he said, the Chinese will try to control the internet, but that's like trying to nail Jello to the wall. He was saying that there's no way the Chinese Communist Party can control the internet. Okay, so let's look. Let's take your example with the platforms that you're on, and let's apply it to a Chinese student coming to America. That student likely has WeChat and spends most of their time on WeChat or some other, or Weibo, for example. Right? They have Tencent. They have all of these different platforms that they're using. When they come to the United States, do you think they get on Twitter and Facebook? No, they stay on these platforms. Why? Because their family and friends are on these platforms. This is how they continue to have connection to them. So, in a sense, what the Chinese Communist Party did, and again, it's these principles in this book, this principle of, hey, we must have the technology of the West, but we can't have the ideology of the West. So we have to create a blocking mechanism, and that's the Great Firewall. Well, the Great Firewall has the net effect of getting, Chinese people to be on Chinese platforms. And this is something I didn't understand until I started to talk to people outside of the country. What systems are you using? What are you doing? And what you find is they just stay on the same platforms. And we here in the West, there's no Twitter in China, but in America, you can have WeChat. You can even go with Alipay to the local pharmacy and pay for things. It's something you cannot do. The credit card companies can't even operate still to this day in China. And so what you've given the Chinese Communist Party by allowing them to do this is the ability to extend the Great Firewall to the globe. So for the Chinese people, the Chinese language speakers, they are able to control the narrative through the domination of platforms, not just social media, but also if you look into the countries like America, like other European free countries, the media, the actual Chinese language media is controlled by a company that has its loyalty to the Chinese Communist Party. So if you're speaking the Chinese language, these are the platforms that you're on, and these are all going through servers that are located in China. So China can, and forget, I'll just give you one example. I was at the Pentagon talking to a young female assistant of a researcher, and she told me, I flew into Dulles, and I sent a WeChat message to my friend in Maryland to come and pick me up at the airport. And she never got the message. Why? Well, because her friend had been one of the protesters of Tiananmen Square and had left China. And so the Chinese Communist Party was monitoring this communication and basically pulled that message out. So the Chinese Communist Party is monitoring their messaging and ensuring that the ideas that are coming into the diaspora and Chinese nationals that travel abroad, they have effective control over the interactions from a digital perspective. and then, as I said, from legacy media. Now let's take it on the English speaking side. TikTok. What is TikTok? By ByteDance. These are also designed now, not the Chinese language people. Now that's the English language people, or other languages other than Chinese, and they are using that platform to also simultaneously slow down the productivity of countries, but also feed them messages that the Chinese Communist Party wants. Why? Because they have control over the ByteDance algorithms. So when you look at how they have integrated into the internet-based world, they have found a way to both control the narrative within China, even if you travel outside of the country, and control the narrative outside of the country through social media platforms like TikTok. They're also on Twitter. They're also on Facebook, and they have the corporate and financial relationships to further at a higher level in the company, essentially pressure companies to do what they want. So it's not so readily apparent that a Chinese person can leave China and embrace the principles and values of the West. In fact, Li Yuan, who's a journalist in the New York Times, writes an article. It's called Chinese influence, Chinese Communist Party influence in the age of Instagram, or for the Instagram age, and talks about her having to deprogram herself from what she was programmed growing up in China, and recognizing that the reaction that she had to certain issues in America came from the programming. And so she talked about this process of going through and rewiring her mind to understand that there's a different perspective completely. This was not automatic, and this came after years. So think about people traveling. They're not going to rewire their minds because they come to America. Or any other free country. They're going to continue to communicate. They're going to continue to do business. They're going to continue. It's just a trip.
This is gonna be a difficult question. I hope you don't mind. I watched Davos. What happened? What transpired in Davos recently? And there were two distinct things that caught my attention. One was Joe Manchin, who was largely the author, or one of two authors of Inflation Reduction Act, which is accused by many of Europeans of being mercantilist and protection, amounting to protectionism, and that it as what the Western Europeans, I'm from Eastern Europe, we don't really have an industry, we're in a semi-periphery status, but Western Europeans claim that this legislation, which is again, I think, a part of a response, because this is essentially industrial policy, that the effect of that will be to suck out investments from Western Europe and drive them to the US. So there was Joe Manchin there being attacked on the one hand. And on the other hand, you had Liu He, who is a close advisor to Uncle Yu, as Uncle He, as they call him. But I've read his speech, and it was apart from little entertainment, like him saying that as a representative of the Chinese Communist Party, he said that China cannot go to a planned economy because it's just not feasible, or saying that there will be no equality of outcome, and that's a Communist Party member saying that. But the deal was, it was a very matter-of-fact, business-like offer to the economic elites. And basically what it amounted to, and I think this will be China's strategy, it will posit itself vis-a-vis the US as, ironically, a non-revisionist power when it comes to economic order. He harped about opening the markets, about rule of law, and not really for the people, but for the companies. So there is because what you recommend, I feel, and what even the US is kind of trying to do now, is go away from the sources of its power, which was this ability for free trade. This is really what made it so that there wasn't counterbalancing coalitions against the US. China is now presenting itself as somebody who's trying to keep this order. And you see the Germans aren't willing to quit China. The French are just angling for their sovereignty like they did since forever, and de Gaulle and stuff like that. So how does the US manage this, especially if they go towards the way you recommend, which is a sharp cutoff?
Well, so I mean, I think this is what I was saying. if we try to apply the principles of unrestricted warfare in our own way, then that becomes a vulnerability for the West. And I think this is one good example of it. If you're going to apply industrial policy to China, and the net effect of that is not to have re-industrialization of the United States, but to have those businesses go to, say, for example, European countries, then you end up upsetting European countries. And I think it's much better for us to establish a free trade regime as democracies, critically and severely isolate the Chinese, because we can't play their game. We have to go and do what we do best, which is enable economic opportunity between rule-based systems. And if it's not a rule-based system, then they can't be in it, because the tendency will be then for us to restrict trade, to create more strict industrial policy, and it will actually be defeating to the success, the primary success of the model. And so by trying to keep China in, we are actually doing their work for them. We are basically creating enemies within. So not only enemies within our own countries, the Republican and Democratic Party fight. Now the without countries within the liberal democratic order, the countries themselves are fighting, because we don't want to. We shouldn't prejudice just Chinese trade. Look at the Germans. They're taking advantage of a tariff differential. No, what we ought to do is basically say, hey, if you want to be in this free trade system, like we did during the Cold War, you mentioned COCOM. If you want to be in this free trade system, not only will we will protect each other with military, we will protect ourselves economically, media, politically, academically, technologically, all the things. But we will work together to promote the freedom and prosperity of our citizens. China doesn't have to be a part of that. Let China do China, and let China, take the Belt and Road Initiative countries, and then let's see over the course of a long time, does that model, actually, bring citizens to their true potential, or does it instead fall farther and farther into tyranny? I suspect the latter, and I think we've already shown that with the Soviet Union. So I agree with you. We can't just say, hey, I'm going to apply tariffs, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, I'm going to protect my industry, but we're not going to look at China any different than any other country, because we basically destroy our relationships with the liberal democratic countries, which, by the way, we need to be trading with. I mean, the concept of free trade is good, but you have to abide by the rules.
So as we're slowly running out of time, I wanted to ask another one, because again, I feel like that the separation between Soviet Union and the US was fairly simple affair, right? It was like a clean breakup by people who didn't really have a common mortgage between them, right? It's very different with China now, because of the interlinks, right? Like it was before the World War I. So it's a messy divorce, so to speak, with a lot of litigation and stuff like that.
But so was Nazi Germany and America prior to Hitler starting the war. Right, we poured trillions in today's value of the dollar, trillions of dollars into building Nazi Germany. We built their war machine. We built their tank factories. Ford and GM were the companies that helped them build their industry. And then it exploded into a world war. All I'm saying is why. And then when it exploded into World War, what happened? We had a clean cut, a clean break. There was no lingering idea that we were going to stay connected to Nazi Germany. We were at war. We had a clean break. So you can't say that we cannot have a clean break from China. You want to wait till a war to have that clean break? Why not have it now, when we have the time to build our industry and then prevent having a war, like we did with the Soviet Union? Yeah, it was easier because we weren't economically integrated with the Soviet Union, but it's not like we can't determine our own destiny and begin to do this now.
Right. I completely agree. But then the problem becomes the possible outcome, that is war. And again, going back to your book, you mentioned how they were infatuated.
So here's where we have a change. Here's where we have a significant change that happened at the end of World War II, and that is the introduction of nuclear weapons into warfare. And nuclear weapons really changed the game of war. And this is an underlying element within unrestricted warfare. The recognition that really we can't even forget about U.S. conventional might. What would happen if we get into a war and then it turns nuclear? The Chinese Communist Party will be destroyed. So nuclear war is unthinkable, and therefore, if nuclear war is unthinkable, then we have to use these other elements to get what we want. So I think the element that was not resident during World War II until the very end are nuclear weapons, and they become a restraining force on activity by nuclear armed nations. So we ought to think differently about warfare, because the presence of these weapons means that the Chinese Communist Party is under legitimate threat of U.S. nuclear forces for elimination. So it's a different game.
Right, but it opens a lot of kind of worms, such as asymmetry of interest or stakes, or places like Taiwan, and whether and those are very present back in how many efforts were made to make U.S. nuclear deterrence credible back in this communist days, right? With the people like West Germany and stuff like that. How
right, exactly. West Germany, Berlin was cut in two. West Germany and East Germany were separated. So I mean, the same concepts apply. The Soviet Union and the United States were not willing to go to directly nuclear war. I mean, we could say that we were close to doing it, but ultimately we didn't. Why? Because we understand how destructive these weapons are, and I think the Chinese Communist Party does. Now, Taiwan is an issue, but Taiwan is, it's within 70 miles of the Chinese Communist Party, and they have the majority of power, military power, and Taiwan doesn't have nuclear weapons. So you have to kind of look at how that's going to play out. It's not going to be any different than Czechoslovakia in 1968. The Chinese are going to move in, and there's not a thing that we can do about it, because number one, we don't have sufficient power. It's right in China's backyard. And number two, it could lead to nuclear war. And so we have to think about these things from a larger perspective and understand that nuclear weapons change the game. And primarily that's an underlying feature that people neglect in unrestricted warfare.
This is interesting, because I've read what Kennan said about West Berlin. And he was like, again, I don't think in moral terms, in practical terms, he said the Soviets are right and their concerns are right. And if we go too far over West Berlin, we're going to start a nuclear war. And, this isn't just feasible.
Which I think is, is a good possibility with Russia too. And I'm concerned about that. So, these are issues that,
but then you risk
there's no easy solution.
I'm sorry for interrupting.
There's no easy solution.
Yeah. I mean, this is very close to my heart, because I focus a lot on like deterrence, nuclear deterrence, and you see this,
Right.
like you see this in South Korea. You see Poland asking for joining NATO nuclear sharing, right? Those things will pop up
Right.
again. Okay, final question. I know your book begins with a quote by Ronald Reagan. I believe this was from the Barry Goldwater speech. I could be wrong, but I would bet that it was. So how would what would Reagan do today vis-a-vis China?
Well, I think Reagan wouldn't look any different. So, I mean, Reagan had the Chinese Communist Party wrong, but remember what Reagan was doing. He was trying to protect us from the Soviet Union, and and Nixon had kind of shown the way. So we were fracturing the world communist system. So I think then Reagan would have got the China wrong. But what Reagan was at his soul was anti-communist. And I think today, if Reagan was alive today, he would recognize the threat of the Chinese Communist Party as being fundamentally no different, except internet and globalization make them much more effective as the Soviet Union.
Right. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in today. My guest was, we have to wrap. I know it's 4 p.m. We had an hour allocated. So my guest today was General Robert Spalding, author of, again, Wojna bez zasad in Polish, or War Without Rules in English. Thank you so much, General, for joining us today.
Thank you.